Hot chocolate, Azure, Cosmos, Dapper. Entity framework, power tools. Technology suite.
Countdown commencing. T-minus 2 minutes.
Jeremy Lickness.
Shiro Dance.
Chris Lampson.
Arthur Vickers.
.NET data. T-minus 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We are go for .NET Data Community Stand-Up.
And we are a go. That's a tough act to follow, Arthur's awesome new intro. So unfortunately, Arthur cannot be with us today, but he left us with that opening sequence. I'm going to get out of the way pretty quickly here. So we have an awesome hour ahead of us, I hope. And the only updates that I have for you, which is a pretty big update, is that EF7 is on its way. Preview 1 just came out. You can go to devblogs.microsoft.com to read the release notes. This first one was mostly just bug fixes and a lot of community contributions. So thank you very much to the community for that. But today, a couple things. We celebrated 20 years of .NET. Just a few days ago. I think on Valentine's Day was actually the official celebration. The 13th, I think, was the official date. We are just a few months away from a 10-year anniversary of Entity Framework going open source. I'm sure some people on this group were around and involved in that, so that'll be interesting. And we brought the team together, so everyone on this call has had some involvement with Entity Framework. So I'm just going to kick it off and start with Danny Simmons, because I think you were here in the early days. Can you share with some of the people who might not be as familiar or excited about the history of EF, sort of how you got started and what your involvement was?
Sure. I mean, I can tell just a little bit of a story. When I first joined the team, it wasn't yet called Entity Framework. It was in sort of the dying days of WinFS, which was this great scheme to build an object-oriented file system that would power Windows to the future. That unfortunately did not fully pan out. But I joined the programmability team for WinFS just as that was finishing, and we were starting to put together plans for what would the future be, and so was part of the initial launching of the Entity Framework V1. And, at that time, it was all about this thing we called the entity data model, and this vision about how it might be the successor to a relational data model. And it turns out that vision maybe was not so well thought out. But there was a kernel of something that became the beautiful thing that is Entity Framework now. So yeah.
That's awesome. So have you kept up with Entity Framework at all? Do you kind of peer over the wall and see what's happening, or have you kind of just said?
I definitely follow relevant people on Twitter and keep my eyes a little bit on what's going on. And every once in a while in my job these days, I get to dip in and say, oh yeah, we need to actually write some data to a database, and I have the tool for that. So we use EF a little bit in my current job, but what I primarily do is so very different that data isn't very central. It's more recording perf measurements for the stuff that we're doing today.
Fun. So I know early in the history, so EF1 was EF Core 1. Entity Framework 1. It wasn't even Core back then. Goodness.
Yep.
Was a controversial release, shall we say?
It's interesting. I think the very beginnings of it, the preview releases, weren't all that controversial just because it wasn't yet known. But then as it got out a little bit more, there certainly was some controversy around it. And I think mostly from a group of folks who were involved in data things with .NET at the time, particularly some outspoken consultants and things like that, who probably rightly sensed that when Microsoft showed up with the data solution that, it was going to swoop in and change the way they worked, whether they liked it or not. And they weren't so happy with the programming patterns that were there. I actually had the dubious honor of being at the front of a lot of those discussions. So I got to spend a lot of time in things like conference rooms with lots of people yelling at me that we were doing the wrong things.
Around when was this, just to give people like a time frame?
Oh gosh, let me think.
Maybe 2007 or 2008, right?
2008, yeah.
Yeah,
I remember one, around that time.
Yeah, something like that. This is at a time when I was actually doing my best to internalize this feedback and lead the charge within the team to make changes that they were asking for. But unfortunately, I was also the face of the team for many folks. And so, at one point, I think Allende yelled at me so loud in a meeting in front of a bunch of other people that the next day he posted to his blog publicly an apology. So it was one of those, you just have to sit there and smile and nod and say, okay, thank you.
Thank you for your feedback.
Yes, thank you for your feedback.
We appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, so for those watching, the list at the bottom, the URL list, has a ton of links that are riddled with exciting documents from the past, including the list of signatories for the Entity Framework vote of no confidence. So that is still out there and available to see, which I would say was instrumental in kind of a pivotal point as far as soliciting feedback and maybe doing some course correction, or it could be just on the outside looking in with that one. But
absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways the Entity Framework was right at a pivotal team for a lot of Microsoft programming tools, where there was a transition from the what we'd say is the old school way of looking at it now, where there was go into an office and dream up this vision and build this beautiful thing over the course of a few years and unleash it on the world. And if you build it, maybe they will come. To the much more sane world that we live in now, where, we try hard to involve the community all along and to work together on an incremental arrival at the right solution. But we were right at that turning point, and we got to be sort of the poster children for learning. It was a learning opportunity.
Learning opportunity. Love that phrase. So I'm not sure in the just going chronologically down the path, was it Tim or Andrew who sort of got involved with the team next?
I think I was, but
Yeah.
Diego.
Diego,
Rowan.
Diego, okay.
Yeah.
yeah,
Totally out
I
of
joined
sequence.
in October 2007. I remember meeting Danny for the first time. But I had been reading his blog before joining, and I was like very, I don't know, impressed. In general, I feel like when I look back that I was like a little kid joining the team, and I was forced into adulthood when Danny and other people left the team.
I remember you saying something about having read about the T-shirt that was posted on my wall at the time on my blog, and I was like, okay, this is really weird. I'm interviewing someone who's read my blog and sort of already knows me. It's a very odd experience.
So it wasn't that odd for me, but yeah. Yeah, in general, joining Microsoft for me was like to a great degree, like meeting people that I had already been following for years and admiring for years. Or like many other people besides Danny. But yeah, it was like a strong, very, very, I don't know, a fast learning opportunity for me to join. The people always use this expression that you are drinking from a fire hose, and it was literally like that.
Mm.
Yep, I'm probably one of the more recent people to join. I know Shai might have joined a little sooner than I was, but there's still a fire hose. It might be a more controlled fire hose, but there's still one. And, moving into the role, so Diego, you were in that role for quite some time, and that was quite a role to step into when I was accepted into the PM role, so I knew I had big shoes to fill. But it turns out the team was very flexible, and they were fine with me just filing items and sending emails. So it worked out in the end. But
yeah, I think that probably it may have helped you to be less opinionated in the beginning than I was.
Yeah, it definitely. For me, the biggest thing joining the team for me was I had no clue just how community involved the team was. I knew the product. I'd used the product. I was in consulting before Microsoft, and but I had been sort of that dark matter developer, so I wasn't really plugged into open source repos and social media. I was in a different way, but not in the aspect of my consulting work. So it was great to see that process and how that team was sort of spearheading, I think, at Microsoft, the open source model.
Yeah, also Rowan and I had like at different times the PM role in the team. When I started, actually there were like several PMs. I don't know, maybe we had like 6 PMs and I was just one PM for link to entities and object services, but there were like other 2. At some point, we ended up having just one PM, and that PM was Rowan. Then, at that point, I was the engineer manager for the team, and then Rowan decided to leave the team, and I stepped into the PM role again. But yeah, it has been interesting. It was big shoes for me to fill at some point as well. As an engineer manager and then as the PM.
Yeah, I think you're the only one who played both kinds of roles in this group, at least.
Yeah, I always said that I have played both on the light side and the dark side without telling exactly which one is which. But
yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Which one's which? So I'm curious for the open source decision. What drove that decision? Was anyone here kind of instrumental in spearheading that?
I would like Rowan to speak about this.
Sure. I mean, a few of us on this call were around during that time, but I think it goes back to what Danny said before, where there was a big shift at Microsoft away from building things in rooms and then giving it to people when it was finished towards trying to involve the community. And I think the more we made that shift, the more we saw the benefit in it. And I think open source was just a logical continuation of that effort, of which .NET and Entity Framework and a few other bits and pieces have kind of been at the forefront at Microsoft, I think is fair to say. So I think it was just the more interaction we saw with the community, the better our products got, and open source was the logical next step for that.
Nice.
Yeah, it's worth remembering, by the way, sorry, that EF went open source before EF Core came around. So EF6 was already open sourced, which is quite earlier in some people. So it's not just with the whole .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core moment. EF actually went open source before that. And if I'm not mistaken, I wasn't around, but that really was quite early for the whole environment. That was a spearheading move.
That was a big thing too to take. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to say the same thing. Like an even bigger deal was doing file new project on EF Core. Like that was a huge bet. Like super risky. Like starting from the ground up for something that we'd been working on for years and just deciding that it would be okay to go for it and try and build it from scratch again. I remember that as being a pretty big deal and a pretty big bet.
You can
I
see
guess
that.
you were. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was
Go ahead,
just
Julie.
saying. I just wanted to say, and your team was experiencing that along with the rest of the .NET teams and ASP.NET. Like everybody was like you'd already been doing open source, but that whole file new project, like all of .NET was doing that together.
Terrifying.
I was
imagine.
just going to say the timeline sort of supports that when you look at the gaps between releases. There is definitely one that took a little more time than the other releases. That's for sure. So Andrew, what was your role on the team and how were you involved with Entity Framework?
Yeah, so I joined a little bit after, I guess, Rowan and Diego. So originally I was working on the sort of original EF. Like Diego, it was super exciting to be working with, the folks that were building the data stack for .NET, and because I'd been in the community as well, just building with that technology. That was really cool. But mostly I'd say it was, I did the file new project on EF Core, and the core group of us in that effort were rethinking how we could build EF in a very developer-centric way and also be very lightweight and performant and sort of cloud optimized and all those buzzwords. So we just we tore everything down. We rethought it from the ground up. Folks here will remember Code First and the original thing we did on the original EF. And so that was a big inspiration. Like, moving away from XML and figuring out, how do developers want to write code? What kind of APIs do they want? Like we would spend days arguing about one method call, like one API call, like coming up with all the patterns for Fluent APIs and all of the nested closure stuff. And to me, that was super, super compelling and fun, and just the attention to detail. I remember that, just obsessing over that stuff. So
I remember when you first started, Andrew, one of the very first things you did on the team was working on this project to use the Entity Framework as a part of building, I forget, it was a content management system or something, some application around it. And it was trying to build things in the way that we were hearing from our customers that they were building things, as an exercise to learn more how the product should look. Do you remember this exercise, and do you think that this informed some of these later discoveries or efforts?
Yeah, I think so. I think there was a lot of that stuff was, you guys talked about alt.net, so those folks. So it was at the time when .NET developers were sort of growing up and were becoming aware of folks like Martin Fowler and design patterns and data access patterns, and so they were all trying to move in that direction, what they thought were really good practices, and that was kind of part of their reaction to the original EF, was that it didn't look like that. So I was kind of tapped into that already, just building apps for customers, and so I brought some of that, I think, into the team in terms of, here's what the community is thinking is a good way to work with data. Here's the kind of APIs and they're coming from, you know, these thought leaders like Martin Fowler and a bunch of other ones that would write about it. Like Allende wrote tons about it. So trying to marry up, I guess, the direction that we wanted to go with sort of how the community wanted to work and what they thought were like good ways of working with data.
Yeah. One of the things that I think was also really awesome that we maybe didn't always fully recognize at the time was that at the same time that the team was trying to connect with some of these thought leaders and the really more influential, you know, I would say fancy programmers in some sense in the .NET community, there were other people coming alongside us who were helping to bridge the gap to everybody else in the broader community and explain all this and bring along. And this is one of the things that Julie did that was so awesome. Help us to have a sense of how to communicate this to a broad group of people and help to bring along and teach them about these ideas, which we weren't always as good at explaining the vision.
Well, that's a good point that I wanted to ask too, because Julie became a champion for Entity Framework very, very early in the game when a lot of other people might have thought it wasn't something to champion maybe. So Julie, what was it about Entity Framework that really caught your attention and made you decide to focus so much on Entity Framework?
Well, I had been doing a lot of work with data anyway, and ADO.NET and, you know, FoxPro Access, right? All that before. And at TechEd 2006, I was invited to a meeting where before EF had a name, and it was coming out of Microsoft Research, and they invited me and just a handful of other people to Bob Beauchemin and some other people to just give us a look at it. And I'd never used, you know, back then it really was more like an ORM, you know, the whole entity data modeling. I'd never used anything like that. And so I was really just curious. And she was like, wow, this is make a big difference in how I work. And you know, and this was Microsoft's, nobody knew about Link to SQL yet. So this is Microsoft's third attempt at an ORM, and everybody was like, not going to happen. So I kept digging, and they're like, not going to happen. And it happened. And all of a sudden I was like the only one who knew anything about it outside of Microsoft. So
nice. So I'm curious for the people on the team when it seemed like it was kind of an uphill battle. Did you feel that this was the right thing to do and you were going to stick with it? Or did you feel like, you know what, we're just going to fight through and do it because we have to, and maybe a little surprised that it took off? I'm curious.
So, I mean, I'll just say, I think when the early versions of the EF were coming out, we definitely felt like it was the right thing to do. And there was a lot of excitement about the opportunity we had to make a difference in a space that lots of other people had done some work in and had mixed success. And we really wanted to make a difference there. But I'll tell you, some of the noise around it, for instance, the internal conflict around Link to SQL versus Entity Framework before the first release was intense and disheartening. You know, I remember in particular when we were getting down to the question of would Entity Framework ship first or would Link to SQL ship first, and what would be the long-term strategy. And the decision came out, well, Link to SQL is going to ship first, but then Entity Framework is going to ship, and Entity Framework will be the long-term solution. And we'll move the Link to SQL team to the Entity Framework team, and you guys can work it out. So we're giving you a mess. You win, but you get the mess. And I remember literally going into my office for like a week and just telling everybody, stay away. I'm just going to go program in my office and ignore the world for a little while until I'm ready to come back out and deal with this mess.
It
And
was
interestingly, go ahead. Oh, interestingly, that mess was still there. I think we were still dealing with the dregs of that 10 years later. Still lots of questions about it.
I mean, we knew at the time, how can you ship this thing when you already know you're going to get rid of it? Like, how can that possibly be the right thing? But it went all the way up to Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO at the time. And he had distinguished engineers in his office from both sides of the conflict throwing their badges down on his desk and saying, do it my way or I leave.
No, I thought the story is he was walking between two meeting rooms, like going back and forth, like negotiating.
They couldn't even be in the same room.
No,
Yeah.
Ballmer didn't do that. People came to Ballmer. No, Ballmer didn't go to anyone. Back then. But he said, well, fine, I'll give you the executive compromise. I'll screw you all. I mean.
No, that sounds pretty accurate.
Well, I still triage link to SQL support tickets today, so it's definitely been around. I'm curious, did anyone think, so right now we have a broad user base on EF6, right? And we have a broad user base on EF Core 6. We're building EF7. Did anyone involved with EF6 imagine that it would be kind of the thing that people used so much moving forward, and that here, so many years later, there would still be so many customers on it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah.
that's how enterprise software works.
Yes, said the person who's still supporting a VB6 app.
Okay.
I think we did sort of know that at the time too. We'd had EF4, which was a huge step forwards. We'd started listening to customers. That's about when I joined the team, partway through that release. Then we did EF 4.1, which I think was another huge step forward in terms of listening to customers. And I feel like EF6 is the point at which all of that stuff kind of came together. We had the big open source move. Everything kind of came out bundled together in a set of NuGet packages. And I feel like at the time, I knew that was an important release. Like it was a thing that people were going to be using for a long time.
Yeah. I think it wasn't super clear at the time that we would ever have the opportunity to start from scratch, or maybe the general consensus that would be a good idea even.
And I think the fact that EF6 felt like a good release kind of gave us some freedom to do that. Like we had a thing that people could use. It didn't have glaring holes in it, not a whole bunch of stuff we had to patch. Like people could use.
It was serious. It finally put a lot of polish on Entity Framework.
Yeah, exactly. And that meant our team could invest a little bit less in that for a while we started the File New project. Scary work.
EF6 was after the move to DevDiv. Yes? Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
where
that's
did it move from?
Oh, way after,
So
I think.
this is one of the other things that was going on, is that in the very early days of the Entity Framework, we weren't part of the developer division. We weren't part of the group that was building .NET. We were part of the SQL Server Data Platform organization, which had a very different culture with some positive things and some good connections in the data community, and some less positive things around sort of the origin of some of this old school thinking. And I think the move, we started making more and more connections with the .NET framework and the ASP.NET team. And, Scott Guthrie was directly part of the design decisions that led to the code first experiences that produced the Magic Unicorn edition. And so then when the team moved, and this was after I had left, but when the team moved to DevDiv, I think that was consolidating this move to a different way of working and a really connecting to the developer community rather than trying to connect to SQL DBAs and a different kind of portion of the community. And really laid the groundwork for what became EF Core and all those things, I think.
Yeah, that jogs my mind a bit. So EF 4.1, which EF versioning was always complicated, but the one that came before EF6, that we were definitely still in the data side for that, because we would have long meetings with Scott Guthrie and other folks, bringing our designs over to go over with them. So yeah, the shift would have happened in the EF6 timeframe, along with the open source move as well.
Yeah, and we moved first to join the ASP.NET team. They were not in DevDiv in the beginning.
Oh yeah,
it was an Azure team basically, and then we moved together to DevDiv later on. But yeah, I think that the main change in culture happened when we joined ASP.NET. We went from them being our main partner to just reporting to them.
So I'm also kind of curious. We haven't heard anything from Tim. So you were involved in some of the earlier days, not the very beginning, but some of the earlier days around the designer and some of those experiences, right?
A little bit. I joined somewhere around 2008, and I came from a sister team that was pretty XML focused, but I worked closely with Sanjay, who drove a lot of the first EF designer work. I think it was on top of EF 3.5. And then I moved from that XML side of the house to PM lead EF 4, 4.1, and then the first code first release, and got to help do a lot of the ASP.NET integration with Scott Hunter and Scott Guthrie, which was really fun. And then I think like some of the challenging discussions around link to SQL, and then just like figuring out how to better connect with the community I got to experience, which some was a really, really hard and a good learning experience. And then, I mean, I thought I got to drive some of those initial community efforts, but I think they were small scale in comparison to what the team's done. And I look across at where the team's taken EF, and I've thought it was really a model for open sourcing .NET as a whole, which I thought was really cool. And I mean, I look across at EF and I admire what the team's done from an open source and community perspective. Like I think of it as a really good model for the rest of Microsoft. That's kind of
that's lovely.
That's really where I started.
Well, you also have a special role today because Arthur usually brings his cat to these meetings. So we needed someone to stand in for the cat. So that's
yes,
a check mark.
Sorry, my camera keeps popping in and out. My kids are home for winter break, and bandwidth at home is highly competitive.
We'll let you in when the camera pops back on. No worries.
I did like the stroking. You have a definite vibe going on there, man.
So I'm thinking, of course, about a lot of the alt.NET stuff in the early days. And I was also, outside of Microsoft. First of all, I would like to say, just, for anybody who's confused, I do not work for Microsoft. I never have. A lot of people think I've always been on the EF team. I'm just a reporter, basically, and not doing all the brilliant work. But so publicly, like in the community, I was kind of the face of Entity Framework. So I definitely took plenty of that flack, but for me also so educational, right? And I when Code First came out, when EF4 came out, and now all the things they were saying, the patterns that they want to use for programming, etc., were now possible. I said, oh, great. Now, show us how to do it with EF4. And the answer I got from all these people was, we're not touching that. So I said, then teach me, right? Show me. And that was, I'd already been programming for 20 years, right? And it completely changed how I think about software. And that was also, that perspective and not just about testing, but why we test and just all of these all these modern practices that now, Entity Framework and EF Core enable, and which led to me getting into domain-driven design also. Like it just changed everything. And so what a thing to go from the early EF to EF4, like to have listened and learned and made it something that all these years later is still amazing and still important for .NET development.
So I'm curious. I had a because you're talking about where it's come, and I think about in my history as a consultant using it as a tool, and then never imagining that I would one day actually be on the team, right, and working with the minds behind it. But there were some interesting projects I worked on. Probably one of the more interesting ones, a client was migrating from another database to a new database platform. I'll leave the platforms out to avoid controversy because that's not the point. But basically, they were ingesting these massive XML documents, mapping them to a database, and then running reports. And the reports were supposed to take 24 hours, but they were taking 25, 26, 27 hours. And believe it or not, and this was probably about 6 years ago, EF was a solution to add perf to that system, because what we did is we switched to a new database platform and had, partitioned databases that fanned out. But what EF did was it was able to take that document, stand up the object graph, because there were multiple related entities involved in a single document, and using, basically, this is getting for people not used to working with XML, you could define schemas and project it directly onto objects. And so this would just project it and save it. And it got rid of all this boiler code kind of looking at properties and figuring out what to do. We just handed it off to EF and got it down from 26-hour process to about a 3-minute process. And there were other factors involved. It wasn't all because of EF, but I thought that was interesting. But I'm curious, like, is there a really odd or unique use of EF in a project that anyone is familiar with and wants to share? I see Danny's laughing already.
So I'm laughing because one of the things that we did in, during the time of building the first release of the Entity Framework, we had a contest within the team for people to go off and build applications using the Entity Framework as a way to get everybody to explore the APIs and test the boundaries. And then there was a demo off day where everybody would get up and show what they had built. And there was some prize even. I don't even remember what it was.
Wow. A unicorn.
There were some crazy kinds of projects where people were very much abusing what the Entity Framework was intended to do. Like the two that I remember most was, there was a project a couple friends of mine and I worked on where we built this text adventure, and we basically used the database as a communication layer. So instead of actually just writing sockets to communicate, every command you typed was a transaction to the database. And then there was another project where somebody actually wrote an emulator for an old, like, programmable calculator. And like all the keystrokes and all the everything was all mapped down into database operations, and you could write programs. And then he wrote a program for the programmable calculator that would like compute infinite digits of pi or something, and it would just sit there running, doing transactions to the database. So both of those were very bizarre uses of the Entity Framework, but not exactly production code, I guess.
I know.
I can share. Go ahead, Theo.
Yeah, Andre, probably Shai, you may remember more, but Andre, there's one of the members of the team, has like a game that he built on EF that I think also abuses EF core a lot. Do you remember some details about that?
I don't know the details, so
I think it queries the game state on every frame, I think.
Must not be amazing perf, right?
No, it runs okay. I mean, it's a dungeon crawler. I think it's like an ASCII based one. So
Cool.
but yeah, there's a funny like perf story we can tell, which is in pre-EF Core, EF was built around this kind of sort of Microsoft research tech called view generation. Like, I don't know if folks remember that. That was a very hairy part of the code. Like Einstein programmers like Colin Meek had like written it. There was this like thought in the team that this thing was just like NP hard. Like it couldn't go fast. The complexity was such that because of the algorithm, it would just take how long it took. And so for some models, it would terminate in a month. For some models, it would never terminate. And then, so there was this like big model we had. It took a month to do the view generation for. One day we get this PR out of the blue where someone from the community has got this view generation of this model down to 7 minutes. And so we're all amazed on the team because like all of us have been too scared to even look at this code, right? So we go into the MR, there's like one line of code changed and there's a .to list on some inner loop.
Yeah.
And that took view generation down from like not terminating for models to like in the order of minutes. And so it's just like a lesson to everyone, right? Always just throw the profiler at something, no matter how scary you think it is. Just run the profiler and just look at the data. And some guy did that and just put the to list in, memorize the list, and
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've seen that with some of the companies, especially in the early days, that were using EF and didn't really understand it well. I remember one big company, some team had designed this is back in the EDM days. One team there had designed the EDM to be used by all the other teams. Just one, big, huge, like the whole database with all the relationships and everything. And there was this query. Of course, they had lots of inheritance in there. And there was this query that was taking a really, really long time. And it was getting back literally one piece of scalar data. Right. And so, and they were doing it on Oracle, but that wasn't, that was not the issue. And it was taking a really, really long time. And it was bringing back like insane amounts of data. It was really because the model, they were doing audit logging. So they had one entity in the model from which every other entity in the model inherited. So if they were trying to find one piece of data from one of those entities, because of the type of inheritance they had, it had to literally look through every table to try to figure out which was. And I was like, why not just write a stored procedure, right? Because that was a big thing people didn't get, right? They were having entity framework to try to solve every single problem instead of, use your tools. And so the Oracle DBA went off and wrote a stored procedure and it took like 9 milliseconds. But so that, that's different than using any framework to do really, really weird things. But, I mean, to this day, I'm always like, learn your tools, understand how your tools work before you use them. But, stuff like that and lazy loading, hey, it's been really good for my consulting business. It has paid the rent. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, that's such a good point to make, because in my consulting, so many customers would say, are we doing entity framework or not? Like it was an either or proposition. And I'm like, it provides an escape hatch. You can drop down to the database and we can hit 80%, right, in entity framework, but that 20% that needs tweaking, we don't have to throw out entity framework just because of that 20%. We can just go and use a different approach for that or drop down the database. And I think sometimes people, want to just use that magical screwdriver and they're trying to work it on the nail and it's just not working. And they don't realize that there's multiple tools. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and EF Core, in the beginning, we really hard corrected. So we said no lazy loading for like 2 years. We just wouldn't implement it. People were like asking for it. And we're like, nah, it's an anti-pattern. And we've got to trade off that feature against other features we want to build. I think we ended up doing it, but
Yeah,
it took 2 or 3 years.
It's
probably
off
to-
by
to-
default, and it's a lot of work to implement.
Yeah, the other thing we
It's
did
a
was like
pain in the butt.
Good
job.
Sure that the framework is telling you what it's doing. So like
Right.
fix all the telemetry and the logging and stuff so that like you can see what's going on, because that's half the battle. People just don't know what it's doing.
Don't hide the complexity and where the perf goes. Make it as explicit as possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Although then
We
we,
still-
learned that some people that we didn't expect actually don't look at the logs, and
Oh yeah, there was that one story. Maybe you wanna tell that
client
story.
evaluation.
That was a funny story.
Yeah, we had this this issue filed by our friends on Stack Overflow. Then now I think that they both work at Microsoft, but they
Funny how
said,
that
yeah,
works.
we adopted the F core and we are testing this, and when we moved from staging to production, suddenly we had like a blackout on stackoverflow.com and nothing works. And then we measure, I don't know how many millions of bytes were transmitted by just executing one query over the network, and they stressed the network, and they were glad that the network could support so much throughput. But anyway, stackoverflow.com was down because of this query, and it was just an issue with we implemented client evaluation, automatic client evaluation on EF Core by default, and we thought that it was a good idea, given that we had been, receiving this feedback for many years that, yeah, if I write the query and it's valid in link, it should basically work, even if some of it cannot be evaluated on the database. And we say, okay, we can make that transition actually implicit and automatic, and we can decide, okay, this part of the query is going to be evaluated on the database, and this other part of the query is not. But we had this mantra that, okay, we need to make sure that people can find out that this is going on, so that when they look at the log, they know that this is happening, and potentially
look at the log.
inefficient. But it turns out that it's not sufficient, because even people that are very sophisticated sometimes don't look at the logs, and because they're moving maybe code from one framework to a different one, and they didn't have logging before enabled, so now they don't have it either. And they move from staging to production without ever looking at what could go wrong. So we decided to change it on a later version of EF Core to just say, okay, yeah, we can do client evaluation, but only on the topmost projection. Nothing else is going to happen automatically.
So, and
there have been a bunch of things that you've had to go back and forth on a few times over the iterations as you implement it, and then go, yeah, or yeah. Like, just interpolated strings with raw SQL, right? Like that was a hard one to find, right? Like bubbled up in GitHub, and to finally figure it out, like, because the behavior was so inconsistent, and somebody finally realized it was because of the interpolation.
Yeah, I would say at that point, like what happened with interpolated string doesn't match my mental model of what the compiler should do. But yeah, that's a problem, and we correct it. Like so many things that we learn about by doing one thing and then getting the feedback and correcting, sometimes overcorrecting, and then correcting back.
So that's an important point that I feel very strongly about. I'm very happy that, and at least in EF Core, I've been here for 3 years, we actually do react, and we do introduce even breaking changes, which is something that, I haven't been in Microsoft for that long, but I think that some of the changes that we've done to correct these issues, like, the client evaluation story, I'm not sure we would have been able to do them in the very old days, where breaking changes were much more problematic. And that's something I personally, the fact that we now we have the the freedom, and we also use it to actually bring the product forward and sometimes make those breaking changes, I think is an incredibly important thing. And of course, it's painful for users, when we first do this. But I strongly feel that in the in the long term of the product, we do the right thing, and it benefits everybody.
The way you document the break and changes is phenomenal.
That's good to know.
And I point people to, it's so readable, so understandable, and so transparent.
Well, it definitely is a new world, and I agree that it makes it for a better product. Back in the day when we shipped the first release of Entity Framework, not only did it ship as a part of .NET Framework, but that meant it shipped as a part of Windows.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so, I remember having to go to bug triage meetings where we had to drive over to the building where they had the giant Windows war room and go into a meeting and argue that, yes, we really should fix this bug because every last change to Windows was a big deal that got super scrutiny. And that made those kinds of things so much harder than the world now where things are more decoupled and you have those opportunities.
Absolutely.
It's amazing to me to think that at one point in software engineering, it was like unfathomable to think that you could ship software every 2 weeks, right? And now today, it's just so realistic, and it's almost a question of you are missing out on so much if you're not at least able to do it, even if there's not a compelling business reason to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk war stories, when I first started at Microsoft, we didn't have automated tests for Outlook. There were a few, but they were really broken and they didn't really work right. We had a test team that would spend a month running a test pass in order to do a release.
Manual testing.
Like this?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And they had giant
the old
lists.
world. Yeah.
And it was a whole different prospect compared to the product I work on now, where we, have a release every night.
Yeah.
Well, the EF Core test suite is now a new industry standard benchmark for how well your machine runs too. So just git clone and run the test and see how long it takes.
Yeah, no typo.
So I'm curious, for me, probably the thing that blows my mind the most in the EF Core code base is the query parser materialization, that whole aspect of going through an expression tree and taking all these weird edge cases, because people are like, hey, if I can write it in C#, it's going into a link query, and then successfully either translating those to the database or figuring out a way to throw out a meaningful error that, hey, you can't do that. So that to me is kind of the I don't think people appreciate just how complex it is to parse a link query and then translate it to so many different targets and whatnot. Is there any other hidden aspect of EF, or maybe it's not so hidden, but something that you think is just, wow, it's brilliant and maybe is an underappreciated feature? Besides the Cosmos DB provider, of course.
I mean, I would just go back to the user experience of the API surface area. I feel like we just put so much work into that. That's the user experience of a library is its public APIs, and it's the thing that the developer interacts with. And how can they, without knowing the product, discover what to do, learn what to do? How consistent is it? How logical is it? How well laid out is it? That's one piece that I think the team should be proud of, just the way you write, fluent configuration and all of the attention to detail and the different extensions to link and the APIs.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember the huge OneNotes we would have from sitting in a meeting room, spending hours talking about 3 or 4 API calls and all the different ways that they could possibly go together, what all the arguments were, what all the default behavior was. I think we obviously spent a lot of time on code in EF Core, but those early days we spent so much time writing code on a laptop in a OneNote in a conference room.
I think it was transformative when we had some of the very early meetings with Scott Guthrie, and his mantra over and over again was, write the code that the customer will write, and then let's look at it and see, do we like that code? and then get it to where it's the code we want them to write, and then we'll make the API match. And that was just, I mean, now it seems obvious, but at the time that was just pretty foreign and new.
And great perspective, right? Because a lot of developers just depend on IntelliSense to. Well, now we have what's it called? IntelliCode.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. But they, instead of learning, or they just want to do what's natural, just what works. So you can help them along the way. That's for sure. And I can't even imagine what it's like to figure out, like what Rowan was saying, how all these APIs are going to work together with Entity Framework and EF Core. There's so much dependency on behaviors throughout the whole framework that, like you change something here and it could have, like, it's just thinking even about the change tracker, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even there was something with I think it was the precompiled queries and the new ability to do bulk conventions and bulk transformations. That's not the right word. And there's one kind of bulk transformation. You can't, the syntax, you don't have the same syntax as we do when we're just using one instead of doing the bulk. And I asked, like, how come I can't do this when how come I can't do it this way? And it's because, well, that won't work with the precompiled model. It's like, all this, like all these little details, like you would never imagine, like the test suite you have, right? Like helps that a lot, but it's just so complicated. And I don't know if maybe because the source is available, people have a little bit more appreciation for the complexity of what it's achieving.
I keep telling myself I'm going to step through just the execution of one query line by line, and I haven't done it yet, but I've made it hours into tearing it apart. I mean, it is so much going on with that little bit of code.
And that transition from LINQ to some flavor of SQL. I remember what is her name? Was it Kadi Isova? Mm-hmm. That was like her job. And she was like, here was a woman who had won like the top math prize in all of Romania, right? She's kind of brilliant. And that's who you needed to figure out how to create the algorithms that would take a LINQ query and turn it into SQL. Like,
and I have to add
that smart.
I have to add another dimension to this. So I came into this whole thing via Postgres, via another database that isn't SQL Server. And back in the day, I joined 3 years ago. Back in the day, I actually maintained the EF5 and EF6, so pre-core provider for Postgres. At that point, for example, the old EF, it had EDM and it had a fixed, like an enum, the kinds of types that are supported. So you had string, you had int, but it was a closed thing. Postgres, for example, had various things which were not in that list, for example, and it was simply impossible to make the product support them or work with them because the way that EF was originally designed was in a way which was, we can say, a little bit SQL Server centric in a certain way. It was possible. It was open. You could do a provider for another database, but you could not go very, very far with it. Let's say it like that. Then at some point, EF Core started happening, and I started, doing the driver all from outside. I wasn't at Microsoft at this point. I started communicating with the team. This is when things became very open source for me as well. And suddenly I was there kind of, annoying the team with, this design is not going to work for Postgres because on Postgres, this has to happen instead. And the whole product was built from the ground up, with this kind of thing in mind. from the very, very start of it, the design was we are not going to be SQL Server centric. We're going to build openness towards other database types into this product. And it worked quite well. And today I can say that EF Core can do things on Postgres or on various other databases that would have been absolutely impossible to think about doing them in the old stack. And that I think so we've already discussed how complicated this whole query translation happens. Think about multiplying that by another dimension of different databases. So I think it's an amazing feat of engineering.
I can tell you from our perspective, I remember like Rowan, Arthur, Andrew, and I talked a lot about you when you were saying these things, and it was always, Shay says that we need to change this because we didn't know that the right pronunciation of your name was Shay. So you were Shay for like 2 years or 1 year, I don't remember well.
Until we met physically, yeah. I think.
Then they finally got him on the team so that they could override veto. No,
Shut up.
Get him to do the work instead. You go fix it.
Exactly.
So are there any things outside of the team looking in that you think, gosh, the team should really be looking at this, or this is the future, or this is what it should pivot on? And I mean, just as an example, it was probably unexpected to a lot of people that it would embrace a NoSQL database, right, and have a Cosmos DB provider. But what future outlooks or what concepts should the team be thinking of that those of you who aren't on the team kind of look in or think about that we might be missing on, or do you think we're kind of spot on in our roadmap?
I mean, I haven't been super involved, but the one thing that occurs to me that I don't know if it's on your roadmap or not is some of these projects that architect around time series data or around event logging database, and then represent the state of the world by the union of playing out all the logs and some of those kinds of things, which are very far from the traditional SQL kind of model of the world. So I'd be interested to see if that's coming.
Yeah, that is actually really interesting. I mean, event sourcing, right, with just not tracking the state, but tracking the change. It seems like it would not even, it seems like it would be really easy.
Oh, wow.
Just kidding. It's an interesting leap though, because you're starting from what the changes are. That's what the change tracker has. Almost like persisting the change tracker in a funny way.
I've thought about that concept too of the debug view snapshots and what it would look like to plug some instrumentation into that and have more visualization of what's going on the fly. But it gives you so much just dumping that string off the debug view itself. But
I'm using that a lot in my new Pluralsight course. I love being able to have that view instead of drilling into the debug.
And show the different snapshots and changes. And yeah, so
Yes,
CQRS is an open ticket, I think. There's some sort of event source ticket out. The other thing we get asked a lot to do that is should this really be a responsibility of EF or not, is synchronization, right? So you've got SQLite, you can put it in the browser now, you can throw it on a device, but how do you marry those data changes, which goes hand in hand with event sourcing, right? Do you event source and ship those transactions, or do we even consider it, or do we stick to what our bread and butter is, which is talking to the database, not talking across the databases, right?
So I don't know if we're getting kind of near the end. I have a topic that I'm curious about, and feel free to veto, but I'm really curious about folks who are no longer working full-time on Entity Framework things. What are you doing now, and what from Entity Framework kind of launched you into where you are now, or what did you learn that has been good for you going forward in your new career?
Who should go first? I'll go first. I work at Splunk, and I own the the query language. So it's called SPL. So it's similar to SQL, but it's for big data. So like what you were talking about with time series data, Splunk deals with time series data, and it's essentially like a streaming language. What I learned from EF was a lot. So, dealing with query processing, figuring out how to take a query, try and understand it, and then build a plan for executing it, which is what my team at Splunk works on. So I learned a lot about those kind of problems. And then just piggybacking what I was saying before, a lot about, we ship libraries in my team. So a lot about developer experience, like what should a library surface area look like? What should the APIs look like? We don't obviously obsess about it as much, but it's still principles that you learn in terms of libraries that have user experiences too, and you can think about those user experiences and make them good user experiences.
Awesome. So I don't know. What about you, Tim?
So the role I do now is really different than what I did with EF, but I think I do carry a lot of things that I got from the Entity Framework team and just working on the product forward. I'm a technical advisor for Kevin Scott, Microsoft CTO. Kevin's job is driving technical strategy and vision across Microsoft. And I crossed most of our dev platform and operating system efforts. I've been here about like a little over 3 years, I think. So I work with a lot of folks in dev div still, Scott Hunter. Occasionally, Danny and I have crossed paths as well, which has been fun. And then I work across Office and Dynamics, and a lot of time spent in Azure too. I think Diego and I have crossed paths a couple times as well there. And then into operating systems, Windows, Linux, Android world. I think the stuff I feel like the EF was really, really great for me in terms of establishing a base was the OSS focus and the community focus, some of this I said earlier, like really trying to listen to what programmers want and doing it. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's hard, and hard to set up the right kind of structure to listen and prioritize how to actually deliver what people want. And then I think other things, and some of this, I think, I don't know that my work on EF, where we were still pretty big box in terms of how we shipped. We weren't very iterative. Like it was, EF4 was my first release, or 4.1 code first, and each of those were maybe code first started to get a little bit more like NuGet package or iterative small releases, but those were still pretty big. And as I've watched EF over the years, like I've seen the chunky or the smaller chunk releases, which I think is just a great way to ship. It helps you get really fast feedback and build more iteratively. So I have always thought back on my time and with the EF team fondly because of that. It's just an exceptional learning experience for me and across the board.
Awesome. So maybe we go to the opposite corner. Rowan, I don't know if you want to share what you're doing these days.
Yeah, sure. I actually left tech, so I work in construction these days. I started my own company. I do lots of different things, but my passion is around tree houses and custom workshops and fun spaces like that. I think the big takeaway from EF for me was kind of the open source listening to customers mindset, rather than I'm the person who knows everything, let me tell you how this should be done. When I go to a customer's place, they're really the expert on their house and what they want to do. In the same way that our customers on EF, they're the experts in their applications and the code they want to write. So I think that mindset is very broad and applies across a whole bunch of different industries, including what I do now.
Cool.
Very cool. Well, we are over the hour. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and coming back and sharing your insights and thoughts and stories. And also for your contributions to Entity Framework. It's obviously a big part of what I do day to day, and that's standing on the shoulders of people who came before. So deeply appreciate that. For those of you listening, thank you for tuning in to our episode. We do this every other week. This will be recorded and posted to our EF Stand-Ups link. It is in the show notes that I scrolled earlier. I'm also going to leave a special link. If you enjoyed the intro, then you'll want to go check out the Unicorns Kickin', which was a fun culmination of evolution on the EF team. And with that, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your week. We will be seeing you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.